Good evening. I'm Trevor Morrison. I'm the Dean of the Law School here. Thanks for joining us for the 19th Annual Attorney General Robert Abrams Public Service Lecture. It's my job to introduce and really to pay homage to our distinguished graduate, Bob Abrams, who will in turn introduce our speaker this evening, the Honorable Heidi Heitkamp, Senator for North Dakota. As I say, Bob will introduce the senator, but I do want to pass along my personal thanks and gratitude to her as well for traveling across the country, potentially missing votes in Washington, or if we orchestrated that otherwise, to be with us here this evening. This is a special series at the school, now, as I say, in its 19th year. The school, as you all know, is deeply committed to public service and to public interest, to training students to pursue careers in public service, and in part to modeling what those careers might look like by continuing to engage with our distinguished graduates who've made their own careers in that field. No one has pursued a more distinguished career in public service than Robert Abrams, and we admire him deeply. This lecture, named after him, supported by him, reflects a 28-year career in government. Bob was a member of the New York State Assembly and served 3 terms as the Bronx Borough President. Then in 1978, he was elected to serve the first of what became 4 terms as New York Attorney General, a position he held for 15 years. Bob received numerous awards, too many to list this evening, for his work as Attorney General of the state, received unusually high and consistent acclaim nationally, very unusual for someone serving at the state level, and I think in many ways provided the modern model for a state attorney general. We are deeply, deeply proud to count him as one of our graduates. His legacy and expertise has not gone unnoticed. His counsel is still in high demand today in work he does in a variety of contexts, including being appointed a member of the Advisory Council for the Retired Attorney Pro Bono Program by New York's Chief Judge Jonathan Lippman, another graduate of this law school. Bob's extraordinary career exemplifies the very qualities that we hope that our own students will strive for. He is, as I say, a tireless and devoted advocate for the public interest. Bob, I want to thank you for your ongoing dedication to this law school, and I hope you'll all join me in welcoming the Honorable Robert Abrams.
Dean, thank you so much for that very gracious introduction, and I want to thank the Dean and Lisa Hoyes, who is the Assistant Dean at NYU Law School for Public Service, for their hard work in helping us to continue this series and to foster and encourage discussion about public service. It's the 19th annual session, the 19th time that we've had this program, and I want to let you know what caused me to come to the then Dean, John Sexton, and loft the idea of having this kind of series. I was reading then, as unfortunately I read now in the newspaper, about people in public life who betray the public trust. Just Saturday in the New York Times, federal judge in the Eastern District giving a 14-year term to a member of the legislature for corruption, for being convicted on corruption charges. And my feeling was that students, law students, are going to come away from this kind of focus with a bad taste, saying that, gee, politics, not for me. It's a corrupting force. No matter how good you are, they're going to wear you down in the end. Government, politics, it doesn't attract the very best. It attracts subpar people, and certainly people who are not motivated by the highest of standards and morals. My own perception of 28 years in public life was something quite to the contrary. The people who I worked with and met were very decent people, were highly accomplished people, could earn a lot more money toiling in the private sector. And so I felt it would be critically important at a critical juncture in a law student's career to have them meet firsthand somebody in public life who represents the real values that I think most public servants bring to bear. And I began to invite a series of people who have come to this podium, attorneys general, governors, United States senators, members of the Federal Trade Commission, and it offered the students an opportunity to see somebody with the kinds of qualities who I think are, for the most part, attracted to public office. And tonight is no exception. It's a rare treat for me to introduce you to Heidi Heitkamp. I've known her for a long time, from the time she came then with long red hair. When you meet her, you're taken by her warm, open, gregarious personality. She's feisty, she's independent, she is fiercely committed to the public good. And I saw that when she became Attorney General. First of all, so who is Heidi Heitkamp? Fourth of 7 children in the family, born to very modest circumstances, farming community. Mother was a cook and a custodian in the local school. Her father drove a truck. Heidi herself went into the workforce early on, doing babysitting at the age of 13, getting to be on a construction road gang while working her way through college. She's done it all. She's done it all. She went to the University of North Dakota for her AB degree. She went to Lewis and Clark Law School in Portland, Oregon for her law degree. She worked for the EPA as a lawyer. She was in the state treasurer's office as a lawyer. And later on, she actually was elected by the people of North Dakota to be the state treasurer and then to be the attorney general. As attorney general, she was a true leader. She won the respect of her colleagues. She was active in a whole variety of issues, important issues that protected senior citizens, that protected the environment. She was a leader in the tobacco cases that the states brought against the major tobacco companies, where she brought $336 million back to the people of North Dakota, but helped to bring tens of billions of dollars back to the treasuries of the states all across the country. And then she ran for governor, and it wasn't a winning race. It was an interesting race in that in the middle of the campaign, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. And 2 weeks after surgery, she was back on the campaign trail. It wasn't a winning race, but I think that's instructive also, because not everything in life goes your way the first time or goes the way you would like it to go. Not everything you do is going to be a total success. But as Frank Sinatra said, you pick yourself off the ground and you get back into the game. You get back into the fray, and she did. And a few years later, she ran what many thought would be an impossible race for a Democrat to be able to run for the Senate and win in North Dakota. And she did. She won that race. It was the closest race of all the Senate races in the country that year. She won by less than 1% of the votes. Less than 3,000 votes, but she won because she presented herself to the people of North Dakota, as she's going to present herself to you now. A person of a genuine ability, of commitment to public service, somebody who's honest, who's decent, who's open, who faces every issue, and there are difficult and controversial issues these days before the Senate, before our country, and before the world. And she does her best, struggling, grappling with what's the right thing to do, what's the right vote in this particular case. And so it's a source of great pleasure for me to introduce to you and for you to see firsthand the kind of person that can be attracted to politics, can win and can serve, and still have all of those essential values that we want in our public officials. The great senator from North Dakota, Heidi Heitkamp.
Thanks so much, Bob. Before I start kind of talking about how I got into public life and what that's meant for me and why I think that this might be a great opportunity for you guys to think about public service as a career, I want to talk about Bob Abrams. And I know I can see when I came in here, this is the Bob Abrams fan club, but there's a lot of young people here who don't know who you are, and you know, politics is a fleeting business. It's been a number of years since you graced the front page of the New York Times, but everyone who's ever been an attorney general in this country knows who Bob Abrams is, because he started this notion that yes, it's critically important that you serve the people of your state and that you protect people who wouldn't otherwise receive protection, and that you do the things that level the playing field and create economic opportunity for everyone. But then he used that enormous personality and that sense of public service to rally all the other AGs towards those causes. Think about this. This is a highly charged, you know, the National Association of Attorneys General, we used to laugh as really the National Association of Aspiring Governors. And so it's a highly charged institution, and a lot of politicians who see themselves as future senators, future governors, future presidents. But yet to have that one person who every day called to the greater angels, come together, let's fight tobacco together. Come together, let's take a look at antitrust lawsuits where the federal government may be dropping the ball, but collectively, if we work together, we can change outcomes. And it really was that sense of incredible power that I came to the National Association of Attorneys General. I mean, I came thinking, okay, this is going to be a group that will spend all their time talking about how important they are, and not to say they don't, but it certainly proved to be a lot more substantive than I ever thought was in fact possible. And as a result, we initiated the tobacco litigation, which I ended up being on the negotiating team. In fact, we joke that every time I come to New York, I break out in sweats because it was just such a grueling exercise for us. But it was really in that vein that all of a sudden we held this industry that had really escaped a lot of financial culpable and responsible for the damage that it had done in public health. And with the dollars that we received, we were able to build public health programs. And so the rates of smoking have dramatically decreased. My husband's a family physician, just to tell you the power of public service and the power of a group like this to actually initiate on an issue like tobacco. There are surgeries he used to routinely perform involving people's cardiovascular system, because smoking is very, very bad on your cardiovascular system. And these would be young surgeries to basically replace veins and replace your basic plumbing systems so that people could still walk. He doesn't see those surgeries anymore. You think about that. You think about how incredible that is. And coming to the National Association of Attorneys General and working together, we began the fight in 1992 to criminalize domestic violence. You know, the President Clinton had been elected, and these guys had been working, but all of a sudden we elected a bunch of women to be attorneys general that year. And we all, kind of separate from each other, had this one goal in mind, that we were going to change the face for victims of domestic violence. We're going to change the outcome for victims of domestic violence. And today we've basically cut the rate of domestic violence in half. And so when you say it can't be done, and you say it doesn't change anything, if I get into public life, it's just going to be miserable, I'm just going to spinning my wheels, I will tell you there's great leaders who have plowed the ground, like Bob Abrams, who enable the ones who come behind him to work in a collaborative way with a mission-oriented goal to change outcomes. And you know what? We've changed outcomes as a result. And I can give you example after example of the work that I did as Attorney General where I believe I've changed outcomes. And my staff frequently teases me and says, you really just want to go home and be the Attorney General again, don't you? Because it was really that place that was magical in many ways in terms of how we were able to collaborate across party lines, across geographic lines. You know, New York is not a state like North Dakota, but we found common ground and worked on issues together. And Bob, I'm so grateful. You should think about all of the things that we got accomplished and know that it was the leadership coming out of New York that made that possible. I don't think people really appreciate that. leadership coming out of states where they generously don't just look at their political career, but they look at change and how they can be the change agent, not just in a state like New York, but also a state like North Dakota. You know, Bob gave kind of some of my bio, and it's true. I grew up, I love telling the story because you all come from places, although there are a couple people here from North Dakota who know what that is. I tell people I grew up in a small town of 90 people, and yes, it was 90, not 9,000, 90,000. My family was 1/10 the population. When I was born, my mother had 4 kids, and the oldest was 2. And there were no twins. It's possible. It's possible. But you know, we grew up, my dad was a seasonal construction worker, and my mom was a school cook and a janitor for most of the time we were growing up. My dad, before that, had a small business. And so you say, that's kind of an interesting pedigree. How did you get involved in politics? How did that happen for you? And I love to tell people this, that when I ran for the Senate, Nate Silver gave me an 8% chance of winning that Senate race. And when I was diagnosed with breast cancer, they plug in all these numbers and they try and do 10-year predictions on how long you'll live. And they told me I had a 28% chance of living 10 years. So by the time I got to the Senate, I thought I probably have if you combine those two statistics, probably had a 2% chance of actually standing here as a United States Senator from North Dakota. And so people your whole life will tell you you can't. And that's really a story that I want to tell you, of all the people who told me I can't, and all the times I said, well, that just makes me more determined to do it. And so when I was a young North Dakotan in the 8th grade, or actually in the 6th grade, I wanted to be the first woman on the moon. And then 6th grade algebra showed up, and I said, that is not my future, I'm pretty sure. And so I decided early on I would be a lawyer. You probably, a lot of you, were interested, or you have family members who are lawyers, said, that makes perfect sense to you. Guess what? I was laughed at when I said I was going to be a lawyer. Because at the time, maybe 5% of all the people in law schools across the country were women. Unheard of. Unheard of for a woman to be a lawyer. You know, what your options were, you could be a school teacher, you could be a secretary. You only did that until you got married. You could be a secretary or school teacher, and in North Dakota, school teachers are a high calling. You could be a nurse, which is the highest of all calling, just ask my father. Or if you really want a glamorous life, you could be an airline stewardess. But you were not going to be a lawyer. And I think that a lot of young people today don't realize how incredibly far we have come, because there's pioneers sitting in this audience, and there are people who believe that that wasn't the right way. And let me tell you, you might think it's because we thought about equality and that we thought about what we need to do. The whole growth in women entering the workplace was designed to stabilize the economies of American families. You say, what are you talking about? I'm talking about a movement called the displaced homemaker. Because as we saw social change and more divorce and more disruption in families, more and more women were living in poverty with their children. There weren't the enforcement provisions for child support. There wasn't the ability to go to the bank and get a loan because you were Mrs. Somebody. You were not your own person. And so all of this kind of attitude that we grew up with, all of this behavior we grew up with, changed dramatically in the 70s. Because women started saying, enough is enough. We are going to take charge of our economic life and create economic opportunity. And so women in record numbers, by the time I went to law school at Lewis and Clark, a third of the class was women. It's probably now 50% here, right? About 50% of your law school class, unheard of in medicine. And think about this. Think about, you guys are all about the same age as my kids, maybe a little bit younger. But think about me opening up a textbook or opening up, Dick and Jane books and actually seeing a woman who's a doctor in the picture. Wouldn't have happened. I mean, you would never have seen that. You would have seen the nurse and the doctor, and we knew which gender roles there were. And so this kind of ability to transcend or to begin to think about women economically in the workplace really drove a lot of what we did early on. Thinking about equity, thinking about pay equity, thinking about all of the, sex discrimination. I talked today about, I'm a Mad Men freak, and I say that if you ever want to understand early feminism, look at what happened in Joan's life on Mad Men. How many of you watch Mad Men? Right, Joan. You know Joan. She started out, she was the office, manager, and she later became an account manager. And all of the trials and tribulations that Joan went through is pretty much the way the reality was for a lot of women in her generation, as she struggled as a single parent. And so when we talk about the changes, we don't often celebrate where we came from. So what does that all have to do with convincing you into leadership now? And I'm not just here to convince you to go into public service, because you're going to be motivated one way or the other. You're going to decide what it is that you want to do. And I will tell you, going into public service will be the most selfish thing that you ever do, because it will give you a sense of self-worth. It will give you a sense of your person and your who you are in a way that the ordinary job will never do. It will give you a sense of mission and purpose that will build your character for years to come. And at the end, when you say, what did I accomplish? Not a lot of people look at that bank account and say, that's what I accomplished. They look at the things and the people they touched and their reputation and what they accomplished for people other than themselves. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time. Either you're motivated to get into public service or not. Either you believe that you've got something that is worthwhile or you don't. Either you want to do that work or you don't. But I will tell you this. The one thing I don't ever want to hear any of you say as young people is, I want to give back. I always go, well, who the hell made you so special? Really? You want to give back? Because when you say that, it creates the distinction between those you're helping and yourself. It creates a barrier almost immediately. And so this isn't about giving back. I'm not giving back. I'm trying to do work that I think is important, that gives me a sense of purpose, gives me a sense of mission, gives me a sense of, working collaboratively and together that we can get something done, the way I felt when we did the tobacco settlement, or the way I felt when we fought the wars on domestic violence and we were able to get laws changed. I want that feeling every day, because to me, those are the legacy pieces that continue long after you're gone. So mainly I came here to convince you to be leaders, not just in public service, but to be leaders. And there's a lot of different ways that you can engage in leadership. And probably the best way that you can engage in leadership is if you find your voice and take a risk. Take a jump. Whether it's running for office, whether it is speaking up at a town hall meeting when you don't agree with something, we have a colleague, a gentleman by the name of Jeff Amstoy. Jeff Amstoy was, I think, one of the first speakers that Bob brought in. He's a hero. I talk about him everywhere. He's a hero of mine. I don't really know him that well. In fact, I wasn't Attorney General, I don't think, ever with Jeff. I think Jeff was gone and on the Vermont Supreme Court. But he did something that no one else had ever done before in the history of this country. He talked about equality in marriage as a Republican Attorney General from Vermont. And he created the idea that there ought to at least be available civil unions. And that started a revolution, because somebody was brave enough to bring the case, and Jeff was brave enough to write a decision. The same decision that in Iowa basically got unelected almost half of their Supreme Court. They didn't reverse the decision, they just got rid of the people who made the decision. So they're going to get their retaliation. And so every day in America are leaders, people who step up, who threaten and challenge the cutting edge. They challenge the dominant thinking. And they do it at great risk to themselves. But at the end of the day, I will always remember Jeff Amstoy's name. I will always remember Bob Abrams. I will always remember a guy named David Atkins in Kansas as a Republican legislator who stood up and fought against a constitutional amendment on marriage equality, on same-sex marriage, lost his Senate seat as a result of it. These are the people I remember. And these are the people who challenge me every day to be better at what I do. And so don't just be good at what you do, and don't do just what you're passionate about. Take a risk and start developing leadership. And you do that by every day thinking about what the goal is in mind, and how do you move that goal forward? How do you change outcomes? And what's the next opportunity that you're going to have? We're going to throw out a couple issues that are percolating right now that you won't hear about. We have the usual challenges that stir out there, but I'll tell you one is the access to justice in this country. I've been working with Cory Booker. This isn't a real big problem in North Dakota. We have a disparity between how I think Native Americans are treated. Part of that's cultural, because if you're Caucasian in North Dakota, you get caught, you go and try and cut a deal, right? And culturally, if you're Native American and you committed a crime, you just fess up and take whatever sentence they give you. And so when you have a system that rewards the negotiator, you end up with disparity when somebody takes responsibility and doesn't negotiate. And so that's not what the problem is right now in America. We have unequal justice. We have literally thousands and thousands of people sitting in solitary confinement, otherwise known as torture chambers in our country. And they all need voices. And if this is something that interests you, this is a growing movement, and it could change the outcome. It could change the paradigm for minorities in this country. I'll give you another example of a cause that's near and dear to my heart. One of the reasons why, when I was asked if I would run for governor, I decided not to run for governor this year, even though, it was really tempting because I lost that other race, so I wanted to go back and win, prove that I could. And Congress is pretty horrible right now. But I thought about why I ran for Congress. I'm a moderate. In fact, when the National Journal did their report, I was the 49th most liberal and the 50th most conservative. Pretty right in the middle, and I hope I'm not roadkill because of it. But I thought about why I ran, and I ran so that we could work across the aisle and be collaborative and actually get this country working again, actually make decisions. They may not be the decisions you all agree on, but actually do the job of legislating for the United States of America. And that's been a huge, huge challenge, but it's been a great opportunity for me as people look to the people in Congress who would be the most likely to actually provide some kind of ability to compromise. But one of the big issues that took me to the United States Senate was an issue that I worked on pretty much my whole political career. And it's probably not an issue a lot of you who aren't from the West, if you're not from the West, know much about. And that is what happens with Native American children. Native American children are an endangered species in this country. Al Franken recently is my partner on this, recently went to a rehab center, drug and alcohol rehab, and he said, I've been to a lot of drug and alcohol rehab centers visiting friends. When you're in the entertainment industry, I suppose that's true. Anyway, he said he's never been anywhere where he felt more despair, even though they had become sober because they knew where they were going home. We had a tribal chairman from Fort Peck, which is a reservation which is just across the border in North Dakota, from North Dakota. And he was talking about the rash of suicide. Native American children commit suicide at epidemic rates. And he brought in a bunch of people because the suicides were happening in junior highs, and public health people. And they did a public health survey of Native American kids. And one thing they discovered is that these 11 to 13-year-olds, 30% of them tested positive for STDs. In what world does that happen in the United States of America? Only 30% high school graduation rates if you live on the reservation. Early introduction to drugs. We had a tribal chairman who was in the office who said 40% of all the babies born in Turtle Mountain are born meth addicted. We're failing, and we have a special and unique obligation because they have treaty rights and because primary jurisdiction for major crimes is with the federal government on almost every reservation. There are 280 reservations. And so these are the forgotten children. And I had a woman once who was working on a project with me, and she was a PhD. And she was a PhD in education. And she was standing in front of a group when she was trying to secure some money to put on a conference on juvenile justice in North Dakota. And she stood up and she told a story. She said, when I was a young girl living Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation, said, I had horrible dyslexia and couldn't tell time. She said, I was looking at a clock because I was going to a birthday party and I was watching out the window. And she said, I probably irritated my mom. I kept saying, when are they coming? Because someone was going to come pick her up for this birthday party. And her mom said, well, just look at the clock. And she said, well, I can't tell what time it is. And about the third time, her mother was really frustrated, and she took her hand, and she scraped the hand over a nail that was sticking up on the window ledge and scarred this young woman for life. And this young woman held up her hand, still scarred from her mother injuring it. She said, and I remember looking out the window, and these are words I never forgot. And I remember looking out the window and wondering who was going to come for me, who was going to help me. There are voiceless people all across America, and they wonder every day whether they matter. And they have adverse childhood experiences, and they have historic trauma, and they need trauma-based therapies, and they need someone to care. And we need a new strategy because we're losing generation after generation of American children to behavior and mental health issues because we aren't doing what it takes in this country. And so that's just one example of where you can be those voice. You are the most privileged people in the history of the world. Robert Kennedy told a graduating class that once. He said, understand this, you are the most privileged people to ever walk the face of the earth. Privileged because you were born American. You were born with an opportunity to think, probably born into, most of you, into families that valued that education, that helped you, that encouraged you. Not all of you, but many of you. And as a result, you're sitting here in an institution, one of the most noble of all institutions of legal learning in this country. How can you be more privileged than that? So you have to decide, as Robert Kennedy said, whether you're going to use your enormous talent and privilege for your own betterment or the betterment of mankind. And he said something that's very important. He said, but remember this, history will judge you, but more importantly, you will judge yourself based on what choices you decide. And so I'm not here to tell you to all go into public service. You've got to decide what it is that you want to do with your life. And I'm not here to tell you that it's easy. A lot of times, certainly holding public office in today's world is not easy. But I am here to tell you that there is work to be done. There are people who need you. There are changes that we need in this country if we're truly to realize the dream of that Constitution, which I can't go and see without crying because it's the most amazing thing in the history of the world, our Constitution. And there's opportunity for you to use those enormous talents to build and to change and to make sure that the world that you leave is better than the world you were born into. Thank you so much for letting me come.
Senator Heitkamp has said that she would be delighted to respond to any questions that you might have. So this is a unique moment and opportunity. So if you have a question, please come forward and come to the microphone and ask it. It's always the icebreaker, Heidi. You just need that first one. And here we have a young woman, I think, heading toward the microphone.
No,
Yes,
she's
okay.
heading for the door.
Hi, I'm Betsy Feuerstein. I'm a 1L. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about or give specific examples about when your legal education has applied and how you've used it.
Oh, I think my legal education is applied every day. It will change, getting a legal education changes how you think. I mean, there's no doubt about it. And it's interesting because I get asked all the time, why do you make your decisions? I had a school teacher ask me this at a close-up program. She said, why do you make your decisions? Do you make your decisions based on your constituents, or do you make your decisions based on your heart? And I said, well, I like to think I make decisions based on my head. And so I'm very methodical. I think that the other thing that the legal education has done for me is I see a lot of different sides to a lot of different issues. I don't think that I automatically, because you have to be prepared. When you're advocating for a position, you have to be prepared to argue any side of it. And so I think as a result of being a lawyer, I don't think myopically. I don't think just it's all one way or the other way. And I think it makes me a better compromiser. And having done the work that we've done on major lawsuits and settlements, we know you aren't going to win every point that you want to win. But I always try and position myself to be in the best bargaining position. And so every day I'm a lawyer. I mean, whether I want to be a lawyer or not, every day I'm a lawyer. And I will tell you, it is an education. A lot of people say, well, I don't want to be a lawyer. I said, oh, a lawyer is the way you think. It's not what you do. In my opinion, that's what being a lawyer is. It's the way you think, not what you do. And do I need a legal degree to do what I'm doing? No. But because I have a legal degree, I approach it, I think, differently than people would who are physicians in the United States Senate. Rand Paul approaches problem solving different than I do. It's true. Barrasso, so I'm much more, I think, collaborative as a result of it and much more open-minded as a result of it. But being a lawyer is about how you think, not what you do.
So what surprised you the most? You went to you ran for the Senate, it was a vigorous race, people told you it was impossible, you pull it off, and you get there. Were there any surprises?
There was disappointments. And I think the disappointment is that there is a fundamental unwillingness to attack the major problems of this country. And by that I mean, I have this saying, I say, every day in the United States Senate we look down. And mainly what we're looking at is political messaging. You see it right now, right? What we're going to do when we shut down government. This is all about politics. This isn't about whether we're going to actually provide contraceptive services to poor women. It's all about politics. And so every day we look down, and I just say, and why can't we collectively look up and see there's a train on the tracks headed for us? And that train is young people challenged by student debt that they can't get out from under. They're living in shared economies, our whole economic strength. We're a consumptive-based economy. What are we doing that's different? What are we doing to provide for innovation? I mean, think about Alzheimer's and think about what Parkinson's and Alzheimer's are going to cost us as we live to be 100. But yet we continue to cut NIH research and make it impossible for the researchers to get tools that they need. We have a retirement crisis looming. And these are all things that, because they don't fit an election cycle, people don't pay attention to. And so for me, long-term surface transportation, infrastructure development, changes that we need to make in terms of how we work with other countries and how we collaborate. What do you think is going to happen? Yeah, everybody's worried about the Mideast. I think you all worry about Africa. Africa is an incredibly challenged continent. And a lot of the theory behind folks moving north and migrating is that it's too hot in Africa because of the consequences of global climate change. And so, we've got all of these problems that nobody seems to have any, but we can't even solve today's problems, much less the political will to think about how we solve tomorrow's problems. And I think what's been probably the biggest disappointment is the lack of political courage to solve these problems. the lack of a willingness to sit down and say, you know what, it doesn't matter if I get reelected. Let's just get the thing done and, kind of move on with life. I've never been somebody who kind of dwells on this. Goodness knows I've taken some votes that means that reelection is going to be challenged anyway. But I figure if I can always convince people that I did it with the best intentions and I did it because I used this and I thought through all these problems that we could in fact change. But I would say the biggest thing is disappointment. But I love telling this story because it's an amazing story as I bitch about being disappointed. The day I was sworn in, because no one thought I was going to win, I spent the better part of 2 months talking to people who didn't want to talk to me beforehand. I always say it. These are all the people who thought I was going to lose, and why waste your time visiting with her? They had a moment of suck up, and so they had to come in and spend a lot of time with me. And so I was really busy putting everything together, and I hadn't thought about this. And one of the traditions of the Senate are the freshman members actually preside. It looks like that's really important, and no, that's grunt work when you sit in that chair and say, objection noted, or whatever, without objection. And so I opened up the Senate. They had a prayer, and I turned around to say the Pledge of Allegiance and put my hand on my heart, and I barely made it through. Because in that moment, I thought about this remarkable country where the daughter of a school cook and a seasonal construction worker from a town of 90 people, against all odds, is sitting in the United States Senate. We have a country where anything is possible, if in fact we believe it, if we're willing to work for it. And so it's an amazing place that we have. I think the dean has a question.
Hi, Senator. I've never stood at this mic, so I couldn't resist.
Yeah.
But so in the two roles that you've highlighted for us this evening, State Attorney General and now United States Senator, you've had a chance to pursue change through two different kinds of mechanisms that our students think about and study: litigation and legislation. And each is a different way of addressing any of the really deep social and economic problems that you've identified. And I'd wonder, just sort of extending on Bob's invitation to reflect on your experience, what sort of takeaway points do you have for the potential and limits of litigation to drive change, and the potential and limits of legislation these days to drive change?
If I can just start out by saying they sound really different, but at the end of the day, it's about collaboration. It's about persuasion. And so both of those things require persuasion skills, and that requires preparation. It requires that you know why you believe what you believe. I.e. in litigation, you better have a theory of the case, because you deviate, right? If you learn nothing else, if you're going to be litigators, have a theory of the case, because the minute you deviate from that, you've lost all credibility, and the jury can't follow you. And so it takes preparation, it takes persuasion, and it takes an idea of what the end goal is. And so I would say there in many ways, the process of resolving issues really does fit in both ways. I will tell you, legislation is more frustrating, because when you're a litigator and when you're a lawyer, you're in charge. I mean, you're making these decisions. You don't have to. You have to persuade a jury. You have to persuade a judge. You have to persuade the other side if you're in negotiation. But you don't have to persuade your colleagues that it's an important issue. You got to resolve it. And one of the big challenges that I've had is actually getting things on the agenda. Because the agenda is not driven by the rank and file members, it's driven by leadership, and leadership's driven by politics. And that's not particularly a good formula for the future of this country. And that's why the United States Congress has a 9% favorability rating, because we don't listen. And so what I'd say is that very frustrating.
Thank you, Senator, for being here. My name is Amy Larson, and I'm a 2L. I was wondering if you could talk about some of the experiences you've had and risks that you've taken that proved to be, in retrospect, particularly sort of fruitful experiences and ones that prepared you well for the job you're doing now.
I think running for office is a risky thing to do. Because think about this, in my race in North Dakota, little North Dakota, I think that both sides, along with the independent expenditures, spent $30 million. I think had I known that when I got into it, there's no way I would have done it. I mean, it just was so daunting when you think about it, because you're just grinding it out every day. And so a lot of the risks that I've taken have been putting myself out there and asking people to give me leadership. I ran when I was 28 years old. When I ran for the Senate, that was my 6th statewide race. Ran when I was 28 for state auditor, lost. Ran in 88 for tax commissioner, won. Ran in 92 for attorney general, won. By 60, when people said, how do you know you could win? I said, I used to. I mean, I got 65% of the vote the first time I ran for attorney general. Ran for attorney general again in 96. And then ran for governor and lost. Now imagine going to a job interview where every person in the state can decide whether they're going to give you the job or not, and you don't win. That's a lot of rejection. That is a huge amount of rejection. And I tell occasionally a story about what I learned. People say, what did you learn having this near-death experience from cancer? I said, forget cancer. I thought I was going to survive cancer. Losing an election damn near killed me. And the one thing I will tell you that I did learn from losing that election, and it's something I have to remind myself today, is that I went through all of this. You know, I've won by 60, 65%. People genuinely liked me. I'm a pretty likable person. And I really, you know, when I won by 65%, you know what I'd ask myself? Why don't those other 32 like me? Right? The Nancy, I called it the Nancy Field, or the Sally Fields syndrome. You know, I want to be liked. You want everybody to like you. You know, Donald Trump notwithstanding, most politicians do. And so I learned that it was really not the measure of who I was going to be as a public servant, whether people liked me. The question was whether I was going to tell them things that they didn't want to hear, whether it was about Native American kids, whether it is about the challenges of poor and moderate income families, because that's where I came from. That's my life experience, and I think that's what I bring many times to the United States Senate. I don't have a pedigree. And I always laugh. People say, oh, you know, the Senate, it's the greatest deliberative body in the world, and oh, isn't it wonderful you're part of this group? And I said, you know what? I'm not sentimental about the Senate. Any more sentimental I am about a car that doesn't start. You know, it's a wonderful institution, and it's the one that the Constitution gave us, but it's not functioning. And so, you know, I think I've gotten, I'm more free than what I was when I was young. And if there's one thing that I can tell you is be true to yourself more than anything else, and you won't be looking back regretting decisions that you made. Tim.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. I have what I guess is a somewhat more directly political question, and that's about the Iran nuclear deal. Barring something really unexpected, it appears that President Obama has succeeded in getting that deal approved. I'm curious, A, your views on it, the views of your constituents in North Dakota on the deal. B, your views on Prime Minister Netanyahu's stance during the whole confrontation, his decision to come to Washington and address Congress, and then finally, do you think there's any lasting implication for U.S.-Israeli relations?
I think that it's yet to be determined what the final outcome will be. I think ultimately Israel will always be bipartisan. It will always be something that both parties care a great deal about. It is who we are. We've made that commitment, and we believe that our relationship with Israel is one of the most important international relationships we have. Now, whether in fact we have done injury to the traditional structure of AIPAC and the bipartisanship of AIPAC, I think remains to be seen, to see what happens, you know, post-vote. But for me, this was a tough decision. And I was one of the first senators to step up and say Congress should play a role, because the president's position was Congress doesn't have anything to do with this. And so I, along with Senator King and Senator Kaine and Joe Manchin, Joe Donnelly, and Bob Menendez, signed on the original package that was negotiated by Tim Kaine and Bob Corker, which was in fact the Iran disapproval package that we all voted on. And so when this came out, I expected that there was going to be a lot of dialogue and a lot of back and forth. The agreement got announced, and within seconds, people were denouncing it without even having read it. Now, there was a lot of advance notice about what was probably going to be in this agreement. But that told you something about what lens people were looking at this agreement. I also serve on banking where sanctions have jurisdiction. So I got familiar early on with the sanctions regime and what that means. Most of you know that we haven't done business with Iran for generations now. We do business with countries that do business with Iran. And as a result of that relationship, we were able to impose secondary sanctions on central banks. As a result of that relationship, we were able to build on the international coalition and include China and Russia, which was a huge, huge piece of this overall sanctions regime that got people to the table. And so once the cake was baked and the agreement was done, the question is, if not this agreement, what? What's the alternative? And so we looked very closely because there's a lot of people saying, well, we could get everybody back to the table and negotiate a stronger deal, or we could just wait to approve it and then try and renegotiate in 6 months. And so we sat down with the ambassadors of the P5+1 and said, okay, what can we do? A bunch of us. What can we do to change the outcome and to strengthen various pieces of this? What can we do that will make a difference? And their voice was unanimous, nothing. It's this deal or no deal. And if it's no deal, we knew that we were within 2 to 3 months of basically weaponizing the material. It might have taken long to actually build the bomb, but we knew that we would have enough material to basically create a weapon. And we knew that our allies would not stand with us as we looked at imposing increased sanctions. And so we then going to tell the Bank of China, the Bank of Japan, and the Bank of India, where a lot of this money is held, that they couldn't release sanctions or we would impose secondary sanctions on them. It became very, very dicey. And so the one thing that also I think got lost in all of this, and I tell people back home in North Dakota, I say, nothing in this agreement prevents us from taking military action or intervening beyond the snapback and the sanctions, and we can all talk about whether that would work. But nothing prevents us from taking military action in the event that we have any intel that would tell us that Iran is violating the agreement or moving in a direction to weaponize material. Nothing. We can, and we're probably in a better spot having signed the agreement and participated with the international inspection folks to know what actually is happening in Iran. Now, with that said, the biggest concern that I had was whether, in fact, the sanctions that had been imposed on the terrorism sanctions, what would happen to those? And I think that the administration attempted to clarify that those would not be lifted, that many of the organizations and individuals for which we've imposed terrorism and human rights sanctions would continue to be sanctioned by the United States. So it's incredibly complicated, and it really came down to, not trying to interject 538 of us at the negotiating table, but whether this was a deal that we were better off signing on than we were signing off. And I think ultimately, the interim agreement, which was widely criticized in Israel, became kind of a model. And a lot of people said, just continue the interim agreement. And so finally, what I will tell you about cheating, Ernie Moniz is a very smart guy. And where there's other people in the administration that I'm not always enamored with, I like Ernie Moniz, and I think he's a straight shooter. And I spent a lot of time with him. I spent more time on reviewing this agreement than anything else I've dealt with in the United States Senate. I mean, that is absolutely true. And at the end of the day, that's my judgment. And it's a judgment based on not what just I've said, but But when back home in North Dakota, you say, what do people think? It's not really a big issue in North Dakota. We don't have a large Jewish community. In the Jewish community, we do have, guess what? Most of them are writing letters encouraging me to sign the agreement. But I will tell you that when I do explain where the money's held and how the sanctions regime works and why we're better off in the deal than outside the deal, and that the deal was going to go forward whether we signed or not, I think people kind of get that this was a cake that was baked, whether they like the deal or not. You don't get a chance to renegotiate.
Okay, so the senator did us an enormous favor by traveling long and far to get here, and believe it or not, she's got a 9 o'clock train back to DC, and we want to give her a little nourishment before she leaves, but we also want to give her a big round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you, Bob.